Hey guys, sorry. Hey guys, welcome to section 1.4, quadratic equations. Let's talk a little bit about quadratic equations. So what we're going to do here is we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by factoring and then using the zero product property. We're also going to be able to solve quadratic equation using the square root property and also using the quadratic formula. Let's get started. So basically, any quadratic equation in one variable just means that right here we're using x. You can use y, you can really use anything, but we're going to be using x. And a quadratic equation in one variable can be written like this. And notice, basically, the highest degree, because remember we talked about what polynomials are and what degrees are. The degrees are the exponent. So the highest exponent is 2. And it has to include 2 or it's not in a quadratic equation. Like if a was equal to 0, then we would just have bx plus c equals 0. And if we have just bx plus c equals 0, this is linear, which we learned last time. Okay? So what is the zero product property? Well, the zero product property basically says, if I have two numbers, A and B, and I multiply them together and they equal 0, then either A equals 0 or B equals 0. If you think about it, just pick two numbers that multiply together to give you 0. And the only way you can get 0 is if one of those numbers is 0, like 5 times 0 or 0 times 10, but there's no other way to make something equal to 0. So always what we want to do is we want to make our quadratic equation equal to 0. Because then when we factor or use the square root property or use the quadratic formula, we can always solve it because we're going to have we're going to factor it or use the other two ways, and it has to be equal to 0. So let's start with 6x squared minus 17x. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 12 to both sides. If I add 12 to both sides, then this equals 0, okay? And now what we want to do is we have to factor. So I don't know if you guys know how to factor. These are a little bit harder to factor, the ones where the leading term is not 1. So if you know how to factor, do it your way. If you don't know how to factor, I'm going to show you how to do it. So the first step is always look for a greatest common factor, okay? And what that means is I look at my 6x squared, my 17x, and my 12, and I can, if I just had 6 and 12, I could factor out as 6. But since I have the 17 and 17 is not divisible by 6, it's not divisible by 2, it's not divisible by 3, it's actually a prime number. That means that my greatest common factor really is just 1, because I can divide all of them by 1. Then the second step, I want to find two numbers. This is called the AC method. I want to find two numbers that when I multiply them together, give me A times C. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call those two letters. How about if I call them M and N? I usually call them M and N because we don't usually use M and M for things as much. Like, well, we'll talk about that later. So MN, two unknown numbers, has to equal AC. And here, A is equal to 6, B is equal to negative 17, and C is equal to 12. Because remember, quadratics are always of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Since they're all plus, that means that 17 is negative, so I have to make sure I put it in as negative. So now I say, okay, I want two numbers that multiply together to give me A times C, and A times C is equal to 72. And then whatever those two numbers are, which I don't know yet, when I add them, it has to equal B, and B is negative 17. All right, so now we should make a table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this column M, this column N, and this column M plus N. And what I want to do is I want to multiply two numbers together. First, I do the multiplication because there's a more limited amount of values that multiply together. Or let me say it a different way. There's a more limited number of whole numbers where there's no fractions or decimals that multiply together to give me 72. But there's an infinite number of numbers that add together to give me minus 17, right? 0 minus 17, 1 minus 18, 2 minus 19, and I could go on forever. What we're gonna do is we're gonna do the multiplication part first. So 72, I always start with 1. So 1 and 72, and then 2, and 2 times 36 is 72, and 3 times 24 is equal to 72, and 4 times 18 is equal to 72. 72 is not divisible by 5. It is divisible by 6. I know that because it's divisible by both 2 and 3. So 72 divided by 6 is 12. It's not divisible by 7. It is divisible by 8 and 9, right? And then if I continued, the next number I would pick would be 9, but that's 9 times 8, which I already have. So now I found all the values where two numbers multiply together to give me 72. Okay, so now I'm going to add them because I have a positive 72. So this is 73. This is 38, this is 27, 22, 18, 17. Ah, I found it. So these two numbers multiply together to give me 72 and add together to give me positive 17. But notice I have negative 17. So now I have to figure out what signs I need. But the only way I can multiply two numbers together to get a positive number is positive times positive or negative times negative. So they both have to be negative. And then when I add these, I get negative 17. Okay. So let me see, let me make some room here. I think what I'll do is I'll erase some of this stuff and move it around. Here, I'll put A equals 6, B equals negative 17, C equals negative 12, okay? And remember, we change this to 6x squared minus 17x plus 12 equals 0 because we always want to make it equal to 0. Okay, so step 2, we found our numbers. Now, because the A is not equal to 1, we have to do the long way. If we get to a point where we have A equal to 1, I can show you a shortcut way. So the long way is we have to take this equation, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 6x squared and plus 12. Those are the ends, but I'm going to change my minus 17 to minus 8x minus 9x. Okay, so I'm using these two numbers that I found here. And if you add together minus 8x plus minus 9x, or minus 8x minus 9x, they both come out to minus 17x. So again, I haven't changed anything. Now what I'm going to do is factor by grouping. We get 6x squared minus 8x, okay? Always put a plus between them. And then I have a negative 9x. I'm just going to put the negative inside the parentheses plus 12. The reason I do it like this is because if you just kind of put the parentheses, a lot of times you'll make the mistake and you'll leave that as plus 12, but you'd have a minus where I have that plus here, where I have that green plus, you would have a minus. For example, what I'm saying is if you just decided to do something like this, which I've seen people do. Now notice if you distribute that negative, that would be minus 12. So to avoid making that mistake, I always just say, put a plus between them and separate them into two groups. Okay, now, what I want to know is, what is my greatest common factor in my first group? Well, they're both divisible by 2, and they're both divisible by x. So 2x is my greatest common factor, and then I'm kind of reverse distributing, right? So or you could say you're dividing each one of these. So like if I were to say 6x squared divided by 2x, I get 3x. So that gives me 3x here, minus, and then 8x divided by 2x, divided by 2x equals 4. So I have 3x minus 4, right? Plus, and now I have to do the same thing for my second group of numbers. So here I'm going to factor out, I'm always going to factor out that negative because I want that leading term, that negative 9x to be positive. So let's say I'm going to make take the negative out, and both 9 and 12 are divisible by 3. So I'm going to say minus 3. And then if I divide minus 9x by minus 3, I get 3x. And if I divide 12 by minus 3, I get minus 4. Actually, I did it in the wrong color. I want to make it's easier to see when I do in the right colors. So this would become 3x minus 4. Now, notice that we have two terms. Terms are always things multiplied together. So this is a term, this is one term, and this is one term, and it's separated with that plus, or actually it's going to be a minus, right? So I'm going to factor out the thing that's in common to both terms, which is 3x minus 4. And if I factor that out of the first term, I'm going to get 2x. And if I factor it out of the second term, I'm going to get plus a negative 3 or just minus 3. So notice I've now factored it. Okay? If you have any problem with factoring, please come see me in office hours or go to the Math Learning Center and ask them to show you. But that's basically step by step how you factor. Now we want to solve this. So we're going to use the zero product rule, which we just learned in the last slide. So if I have two things multiplied together equals 0, one of them has to equal 0. So here I have, let's call this A, and we'll call this B. And now I have two values multiplied together to equal 0, which means that either 3x minus 4 equals 0, or 2x minus 3 equals 0, right? Because one of those parentheses has to equal 0. And now I solve for x. So here, for the first one, I add 4 to both sides and divide by 3. So I get x equals 4/3, or x equals, and again for this one, I add 3 and divide by 2, and I get 3/2. So now I have actually solved this quadratic equation using factoring, okay?